Hey everybody, CyberTab back with you. This is going to be a roundup of everything that we've learned about how to handle hanging pawns. And then next session we're going to be moving on how to fight against the hanging pawns. Really the name of the game when you're playing with hanging pawns is all about aggression. Um, I would say even more so than isolated pawns. You are obliged to play aggressively with hanging pawns. You never want to play passively or just shift around. You always want to be looking out for your own share of the play. Now, so often that is going to come via pawn breaks. Sometimes the C pawn break, but almost always the D pawn break. We did look at a couple of examples of how to gain active play uh, without any pawn breaks. So the pawn here is on c3. It's doing a perfectly fine job of supporting the pawn on d4, so this allows white a completely free hand to take up a kingside attack, and that starts with h4 here. It's important to have this in your mental database, these piece maneuvers. The bishop is ideal on d3, h4 is played to support the knight hopping into g5, so there are some occasions where you're achieving pure piece play against the king side without having to worry about pushing either of your hanging pawns. In this particular instance, it goes beautifully well. All the pieces are just hopping into the king side. Because this pawn is still on c3, black doesn't have any counterplay to speak of, so white's just able to tee off without having to worry about any counterplay. But this is sort of an idealized version. I would say this is the minority of cases. Usually, you're going to end up in a position like this, where the hanging pawns are standing next to one another. And almost always, your play is going to come via either threatening to play d4, d5, or d5, d4 in this case, or flat out playing it. There are some exceptions. So here, black, this is Bernstein Capablanca, black plays c4 here, which is sort of a controversial choice. It's not necessarily better or worse for black, it just sort of makes the position a bit more imbalanced. So sometimes you'll get your share of the play by playing the c-pawn forward to gobble up in a bit more space. Here it's specifically good because it puts the pawns on separate color of his remaining bishop, so it enhances the power of his dark square bishop. But really, the focus of hanging pawns is that d-pawn break. So often with those hanging pawns, you're going to be looking to play the d-pawn break is either a line clearance move or creating a strong pass pawn in its own right, either or. We really started the series with the idealized game of Nimzovich against Tarash, and here that d4 break is devastating. Here, it's a direct pawn sacrifice, but the way these bishops are just completely lined up against the white king side, just completely devastating. And that's exactly, in that position, that's exactly why you play that d4 move, to break open those diagonals and lines to make that kingside attack possible. And we looked at a couple other idealized examples of this. This was Kasparov-Portish. Again, that d5 move is being played for exactly the same reason, to bust open all those lines on that diagonals headed to the black king side. It's a line clearance sacrifice. You're enhancing the power of your pieces by playing that d-pawn break. That's exactly what you want to be on the lookout for when you're playing with hanging pawns. Yet another example. This is a bit more of a double-edged example, because here d4 isn't a direct knockout. Here it's a bit more of a crafty tile sacrifice. But this is being played for the exact same reason. All the black's pieces are ideally lined up behind those hanging pawns. The bishops are lined up on those adjacent diagonals heading directly to the white king. All the black's pieces are set up perfectly to take advantage of this d4 pawn break. And white goes wrong immediately, and this leads to just absolute devastation. Now, there are some instances where you play the d-pawn break simply to create a strong pass pawn in its own right, to enhance the power of that pawn. It's not always a line clearance sacrifice. I would say that's a bit more minority of cases, but we did look at this example, Mamedyarov against Adams, where that d-pawn is a strength in itself. We didn't play that d-pawn break to bust open our pieces. We're just creating a strong pass pawn on its own. And Mamedyarov took care of that quite nicely. But really, emphasis that I want to put on this review is that d-pawn break with the hanging pawns is so often the heart of your position. Sometimes you'll achieve positions where you achieve pure piece play against the king side. Sometimes you'll achieve positions where you push the c-pawn instead. I would say those are a minority of cases, because a lot of times that c-pawn push is a positional concession. But really the beating heart of the hanging pawns is that d-pawn break, because so often any pawn break is going to be the strategic beating heart of the position and creating play. With hanging pawns, it is absolutely the case that the d-pawn break is exactly what you want to be on the lookout for, whether it's to create a strong pass pawn on its own, like in this position, or in a game like Nimzovich Tarash, where it's just a straight line clearance sacrifice where you're just getting after the king side and busting everything open. In either of those cases, that d-pawn break is exactly what you want to be on the lookout for. So, with those ideas on board, you should be able to play with hanging pawns competently. Next session, we're going to be taking a look at reviewing how to play against hanging pawns. So, my name is John. I'll see you then.